Let's turn our attention now to reflection on this Freedom Day. As South Africans celebrate Freedom Day and look back at the gains achieved in the past 29 years. Trade Union Federation Saftu says the fruits of freedom are only enjoyed by the political and economic elites. Saftu General Secretary Zwelinzima Vavi joins us now to elaborate further on this view. Dr. Vavi, good evening, and thank you very much for coming on this evening, and some challenges there with the connection. But when one looks at South Africa and where we are 29 years on, the idea that ideas of power and where resources are being directed are only controlled by few in the higher echelons of education, of industry, of banking, of science, of civil society, and so on and so forth, seems to be a far-fetched idea if you consider that we've had so many elections and so many opportunities to elect who is in leadership. How do you rationalize that view to say, well, up until this point, with all the liberties that we have, particularly in selecting who's in power, we are still pretty much, as far as policy is concerned, ruled by those who are political elites?
Thank you for the opportunity to speak on this very important, critical matter on this historical day for South Africa. Let me start here, There's nothing more inhuman than the apartheid system to any human being. And irrespective of our disappointments, irrespective of our critics or critical mind about the progress we have achieved and not achieved in the past 29 years, but that we were liberated ourselves from apartheid was a massive development politically in South Africa. And I'm sure you and many others who lived under that conditions of apartheid know that it was evil, it was inhuman, and it took every aspect of our human dignity away from us. So that we defeated that system is not a small development in the history of South Africa. Having said though that, the point that Saftu is making is that the advent of the liberal democracy provided democratic rights and freedom, but without economic liberation, these cannot be genuinely fulfilled within a capitalist framework. And we're saying that central to this contradiction of the bourgeoisie democracy is that it commodifies all of the rights that we should be enjoying from Section 27 of the Constitution and all of its Bill of Rights guarantees. It promises us that we will have a full development in terms of the rights to water, to electricity, education, healthcare, including the right to employment. But unfortunately, when you have a low-intensity democracy and when you having all of these rights in the Constitution commodified, you suddenly see that, yes, once you have possibilities of having electricity, but electricity having increased by 800% since 2007 is such that only the few can access it. All studies show that South Africa is increasingly abandoning its stoves, its kettle, electronic kettles and all of that, and that women are going back to being the wooers of wood in our country. Right. If you look at the access to water, the fact that it's now commodified, education is commodified, at least for those who still don't have access to free education, healthcare commodified, and most of these basic services commodified. It then means that those who can access them are those that can afford to pay for them. And those who cannot afford to pay for them will then, in particular for the 12 million people who are unemployed, it means that they can have it on paper, but their reality speaks to something else.
So how have we and why have we allowed that elite policy messaging on paper to shape and convince the policy attitudes of the broader public?
Unfortunately, to the disappointment of millions, the government led by the ANC have been refusing to consider any other option to development other than what is popularly known as the Washington Consensus or neoliberalism. Worst of all now, in response to the 2008 world economic crisis, the austerity program, which is based on cutting budgets from even the most basics of services that government provide to the 70-80% of the population that depends on government services. When you have a government that is hell-bent on limiting its role as just creating an environment and for business to make more profits, instead of seeing itself as an agent of development, of change, as the agent for transformation of society, then you will then face the crisis that you have these rights, including for workers, not just for issues of electricity, water, and so forth. But even for workers. When workers have all of these brilliant protections in the Constitution, such as giving them a right to collective bargaining, to a right to strike, and all of that, but in reality they are unemployed, and or that 75% of the employed people are earning a mid-range wage of below 5,800 rands, and which doesn't give them access to food or nutritious food, doesn't give them access to electricity, to water, and all of these other municipal services, because all of them have been commodified. Then you find that now there is a contradiction between what is written in the Constitution and the reality that our people are experiencing on every day in their lives.
In terms of democratic decision-making, right, if we agree that this is how it happens, it tends to assure that voters would have preference, right? And when voters have preference, then politicians must adjust their platforms to conform to the voters' preference. So if a majority of the people, as you put it, would not prefer that kind of a situation and that kind of an outcome, why do the political outcomes never reflect that?
I normally explain it in one way, that the ANC never really appreciated and understood how entrenched its legacy amongst, in particular, the former oppressed black people are. The black people really saw the ANC as the only weapon in their hands to effect this fundamental transformation and to realize all the aspirations as you will see them in the RTP, in the Freedom Charter and other historic documents. And when they got disappointed about the lack of that transformation, or that transformation ended up benefiting in economic terms the former white oppressors instead of them, the liberated motive forces of the liberation, they began to slowly turn away from the ANC, and slowly you will hear them in the streets or when you interview them to say, we will not vote and because we are disappointed. And they loved the ANC so much that when they say they are not going to be voting, they mean that we're going to be punishing the ANC. And unfortunately, the majority of the South African citizens, as we speak, are not voting for any political party. They are increasingly not voting for the ANC. The majority of South Africans are now not participating in the electoral system in the country. And therefore, you have a crisis of legitimacy of even all of the leadership of the political parties. Unfortunately, this also applies for the trade union movement, which are now only representing 23% of the workforce. So you have a crisis of representation. You have a growing discussion being informed by a call by the people or a question, who is representing us? Because the people in parliament are not a product of our democratic participation anymore. And because we are being turned away from the politics by the shenanigans of the current political system and the fact that it is not addressing the most fundamental crisis of unemployment, poverty, inequality, and corruption that remains the core concern of the majority of South Africans.
Now, most political scientists then would tell you that that's exactly what the political elite would want, that voter apathy, that in a sense would continue to perpetuate this entrenchment of the political elite. What needs to happen? I mean, why are you, for example, Saftu and such organizations that think like you are unable to change the people's public policy preference? Because it seems now that needs to be your job to do that.
Well, it can only happen when there is an increased levels of consciousness, political consciousness amongst the workers first, but also amongst the broader working class communities. And when that political consciousness is low because there's been less emphasis on political education and more emphasis on individualism in society, and that we increasingly became a politics of a big man instead of a genuine people-centered democracy that will depend on the ordinary masses of the people to create contradictions that will guarantee a movement forward. That's our central problem. There is no confidence, and therefore the people rather tend to say we are not represented, we are not participating in the election, which itself constitutes a big danger. Because if we were to look at the statistics today, the majority of South Africans are not participating in any elections, which means that the political system have long lost its legitimacy. The majority are finding other means of expressing their views. For example, South Africa have 5 major protest actions every single day. And this is making South Africa the capitalist, or the protest capital of the world. There is nowhere in the world where you have 5 major protests every single day, which sometimes go up to 13,000, 14,000 protest action in a single year. And that's what is what we call constituting a ticking time bomb, because one day that majority that is not seeing the politics as the solution to the crisis that they are facing will resort into other means of expressing their disgust at the fact that democracy is leaving them, the majority, now behind.
All right, that Vavi, because of time, let's leave it there. I appreciate you. Thank you very much for coming on. Saftu General Secretary there, Zwelinzima Vavi.